President Cyril Ramaphosa says former President F.W. De Klerk was forced by circumstances to release Madiba from jail 30 years ago. He was speaking from the same spot where Nelson Mandela made his first public speech after spending 27 years in jail for standing up against oppression. Ramaphosa says Madiba's release was a catalytic moment in South Africa's history. Meanwhile, former Robben Islander Seth Mazibuko says increasing poverty levels in the country are a dent in Mandela's legacy. Mazibuko slammed politicians for failing to follow Madiba's principles instead of putting themselves first.
That same Cyril is the same Cyril that caused the death in Marikana. That same Cyril is the same Cyril that cannot be able to give people land so that they can be having homes. Do I have something to celebrate on this day?
Yeah.
No. No.
So then,
am I angry? Yes, because we are misrepresenting.
Well, for more on today's event, we now cross live to our reporter in Cape Town, Samkele Maseko. Samkele, good evening and welcome to The Full View. Before we start speaking about the speech that was delivered by the president, tell us about the people who were there and what they had to say about the release of Nelson Mandela.
Well, our colleague Natasha Piri was engaging with the various South Africans and international tourists who were gathered at the Grand Parade where former President Nelson Mandela, upon his release on this day of the 11th of February 1990, walking alongside Mama Winnie Mandela and many of those who struggled for our freedom, whether they be in the UDF, in the ANC and in other liberation movements who were part of our liberation struggle, who walked with Nelson Mandela outside of that prison when he was released on this day. They shared their moments, saying some of them, they were there on that particular day. Some of them were in their homes watching on TV. We had the privilege of having an opportunity to have that particular TV set to see this particular news of Tata Nelson Mandela being freed and delivering that speech. Some were saying they were abroad and also watching on their television screens as they were home, seeing that South Africa has been ushered into a new political era, in the words of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who stood alongside Tata Nelson Mandela, holding a mic for him as he addressed the people of Cape Town and of the Western Cape for hosting him on all of those years, almost 3 decades behind bars held by a regime of the apartheid government. So you heard President Cyril Ramaphosa saying that Tata Nelson Mandela first wanted to thank the people of the Western Cape. So the various people that were gathered here and students as well were very grateful to have this particular interaction with the president and listen to the president remark on all of those years he was alongside Tata Nelson Mandela when he was released in 1990 on this particular day, and being beside him on this particular day, and even holding a mic and being part of the reception committee that received Tata Nelson Mandela when he was released. President Ramaphosa also relating of how he, Bulelani Nguka and Trevor Manuel, who were part of this committee of organizing transportation for President Mandela upon his release, almost lost the president for about an hour in that particular convoy that was there, with the magnitudes of the people that were gathered in the streets welcoming him back after he was released from prison, saying he was lost for about an hour. But President Mandela did emerge out of that particular reception of those people who were welcoming him back into the public domain and to deliver his first speech upon his release.
Well, last week we heard from former President F.W. De Klerk. This was on the 2nd of February, marking the announcement of the release of Nelson Mandela as well as the unbanning of liberation movements. And in a couple of interviews that he had, he almost tried to set the record straight and arguing that the ANC cannot take credit for the announcement that was made at the time, and also saying that if it was not for the announcement that was made, South Africa could have ended up like Syria, for instance. And today we hear the president almost like what sounded like a rebuttal, in where the president said it was not out of the kindness of F.W. De Klerk's heart that he released the former President Nelson Mandela.
Indeed, Eldrin, President Cyril Ramaphosa seemingly did not have kind words for the last apartheid president, that would be F.W. De Klerk, when it comes to the release of Nelson Mandela, saying that it was not out of the goodness of his heart, it was not that he was a kind man that he released Nelson Mandela, it was because of the pressure that South Africans and the world were exerting on South Africa. And Mama Winnie Mandela flying the flag high in the Free Nelson Mandela campaign. You would remember, Eldrin, that in the history books, when you read that the struggles of the Mandela family and how Winnie Mandela was keeping the fires burning, particularly in the townships and even globally with that campaign, Free Nelson Mandela. You would remember Zinzi Mandela addressing a UDF rally, saying that her father saying, "Aluta continua, the struggle must continue." He will never surrender his own freedom just because they want to let him out, and that the struggle must be abandoned, but saying that they must soldier on. He will stay in prison until freedom is brought on to South Africans. Even earlier on, watching through the day and seeing various comments being made about the legacy of Nelson Mandela, even the president himself in that subtle rebuttal to F.W. De Klerk, which was very loud, not rather subtle, basically saying that it was not out of the goodness of his heart for the release of Nelson Mandela, but it was through the work and the mobilization of all South Africans. You remember Natim Tetwa, the minister there, speaking about the issues of how the Morogoro Conference of the ANC, in the four pillars that they had, that they wanted to usher in freedom of the country. The Minister of Sports and Arts and Culture being very clear that mass mobilization was one of them, and conscientizing people, and also getting support globally so that pressure could be exerted on the South African government for there to be freedom in this country, which was to be ushered in 1994 with the first democratic elections, but first in 1990, 11th of February, with the release of Nelson Mandela. But President Ramaphosa being very clear that it was not through the goodwill or the good heart that F.W. De Klerk released Nelson Mandela from jail. That would be the last apartheid president who spoke on that particular day, and with that commemoration last week of his speech of the unbanning of all liberation movements and the release of political prisoners at the time, which Nelson Mandela formed off, which the likes of Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada were also there in this very same city of Cape Town, imprisoned on Robben Island.
Well, thank you so much, Samkele Maseko. They're joining us from Cape Town, where we had the commemorations marking the release of Nelson Mandela. And as is indicated, that our reporter Natasha Peer actually spoke